Maggie Calloway didn't knock twice. When Silas Holt turned that lock from the inside, click, final as a coffin nail, she stood on that porch with 6 months of baby pressing against her ribs, 3 children crying in the snow behind her, and $4.30 between her family and the Wyoming wind. She didn't beg, didn't pound the wood. She turned around, faced that blizzard straight on, picked up her carpet bag, and started walking. Because a closed door was still information, and Maggie Calloway had always known what to do with information. Before we go any further, if this story moves something in you, please hit subscribe and leave a like right now. Drop your city down in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that snow-covered road and find out what a woman does when every door closes at once. The train had smelled like coal smoke and other people's grief for 3 straight days. And somewhere around the Nebraska border, Maggie had stopped noticing either one. Henry was asleep across her lap, boots still muddy from the Omaha platform, dead weight against her thighs. She hadn't shifted in 4 hours, didn't want to wake him. Rose was curled into her right side, one small fist twisted into the wool of Maggie's coat, breath coming in the slow, even rhythm of a child who'd cried herself completely empty around supper. Clara sat straight-backed at the window, watching the dark prairie move past like she was memorizing every mile of it, like she already knew they might need to find their way back. Maggie kept her left hand resting light on her belly. Sometime after 2 in the morning, the baby rolled, a slow, full-body turn that pressed hard against her lowest rib. And she pressed back, gentle, just to let it know she was there. She had written Franklin Holt 7 letters before she said yes. 7. Each one harder than the last. Does he drink? Does he have a temper? Has he ever raised his hand to a woman or a child? What does he want from a wife? Plain and honest, no softening. Does he understand that her children come first, every time, without exception? And if he can't accept that, he should say so now, rather than waste her time crossing half the country. Franklin had answered every question in that same slow, careful handwriting. The penmanship of a man who didn't write often, but meant every word he committed to paper. He didn't drink more than 1 whiskey at Christmas. He'd never struck a woman or a child, and didn't intend to start. He had a house with 4 bedrooms and a cook stove that actually drew right, which was more than most men in Wyoming could offer. He understood about the children. He'd been alone 11 years since his wife passed, and he reckoned a house full of young ones would suit him better than the quiet ever had. She'd told him about the baby in her reply. Straight out, no softening. 3 months along and already showing, and she was not going to arrive and surprise a man with something like that. He'd written back in 10 days. Said it didn't change a thing. Said a baby needed a father same as the others, and he was prepared to be exactly that. She had thought he was the best man she'd ever encountered through paper alone. The train pulled into Clearwater, Wyoming on a Tuesday morning in November, with 4 inches of fresh snow on the platform, and a sky the color of old pewter pressing everything flat. Clara grabbed Maggie's arm, getting off the steps, steadying her without being asked. 9 years old, and already doing it without being asked. "I've got it," Maggie told her. "I know you do," Clara said, but she didn't let go until they were on solid ground. A man stood at the far end of the platform, hat pulled low, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Maggie collected the children, picked up both carpet bags, everything left of her life in 2 bags, and walked toward him with her chin level and her spine straight, the way her mother had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why. How you walk into a room tells people what you think of yourself before you ever open your mouth. The man looked at her belly first, then at Clara, then at Rose, then at Henry sleeping against Maggie's shoulder. then finally at her face, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite name. "Mrs. Calloway?" "That's right. You must be Franklin." She shifted Henry to her other hip and extended her free hand. "It's a pleasure to finally—" "I'm not Franklin." He took off his hat. 40, maybe, thick through the shoulders, with a face that wind and years had worked on considerably. "I'm Silas Holt, Franklin's younger brother." Maggie's hand dropped. "My brother passed," Silas said, 3 weeks back. His heart." The platform seemed to tilt, just slightly, just enough. Maggie set Henry down on the nearest trunk before she dropped him, and she put one hand on the post beside her, just for a moment, just until the world remembered which direction was down. "I'm sorry," she said, because she was. She'd never met the man, but she'd read his careful handwriting 12 times over, and she was genuinely sorry he was gone. Silas looked at her hand on the post. Something crossed his face. Not cruelty, not quite. More like a man who'd already done the hard arithmetic and had come to collect the answer. "I've got a buggy. Mrs. Parrish runs a boarding house on Main Street. Clean enough." "Thank you." She picked Henry back up. "In the house? Franklin's house? I'd like to get the children settled and then we can discuss the—" "That's what I need to talk to you about," Silas said, flat. Already decided. He drove them to the boarding house without saying much. Clara sat rigid beside Maggie in the back of the buggy. Rose pressed against her other side. Henry wedged between Maggie's knees. The snow came sideways and thin, and the cold had teeth that Iowa cold didn't have. Mrs. Parrish met them at the door. Small woman, sharp eyes, the kind who noticed everything and said half of what she knew, which Maggie generally respected. She looked at the children, looked at Maggie's belly, looked at Silas, and her expression arranged itself into something carefully neutral. Inside the front parlor, Silas sat across from them all. Clara straight-backed and watchful. Rose pressed to Maggie's side. Henry already half asleep again. And he turned his hat slowly in his hands. "There's no easy way to say this." "Then say it plain," Maggie told him. He looked at his hat. "Franklin's estate belongs to me. He never changed his will after he wrote to you. Legally, you have no claim on the property." He set the hat on his knee. "I'm sorry for your trouble, truly, but I intend to sell, and there's nothing in writing that gives you any standing here." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "It's November," she said. "I have 3 children. I'm 6 months along, and you're giving me a week." "That's fair." "Is it?" He stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and for just a moment, just one, he didn't move. His shoulders held something that looked almost like hesitation. Then he put on his hat. "I didn't make your circumstances," he said, quieter than before. "I truly am sorry about Franklin." He walked out without looking back, like a man who couldn't afford to. Clara waited until the sound of the buggy faded. Then she said, very carefully, "Mama, what does that mean for us?" "It means we figure out our next step." Maggie kept her voice even. "What is our next step?" Henry pulled on her sleeve. "Is that our house?" "Not yet, baby." "Is it gonna be?" Rose had started to cry again, the soft, exhausted kind. Maggie pulled her close and rocked her once, and looked at Clara over the top of Rose's head. And Clara looked back with those old eyes and that young face, waiting to see how her mother was going to carry this. "We're not leaving Wyoming," Maggie said. Clara nodded, slow, deliberate, like she was filing the information somewhere important. "Okay." That night, after the children were asleep, both girls in one bed, Henry curled at the foot of the other, all three of them in their coats for extra warmth. Maggie sat in the chair by the alley window with her mother's ledger open in her lap, and she let herself think clearly about what she actually had. $4.30. $1 a night for the room. 3 nights left after this one. References. Written. From the Miller household in Iowa. 7 years of her husband Daniel's books, kept clean and precise. 2 years of the Miller accounts. Costs cut by 31% the first year. The ledger itself. 6 years of careful columns in her small, tight handwriting. 3 children, 1 coming, and a body that ached in places she hadn't known could ache. She pressed her palm to her side, where the baby had gone quiet. The chair was hard. Her lower back had been a constant low fire since somewhere around Cheyenne, the kind of deep ache that came from carrying this much weight on a frame not quite designed for it. And the 4-hour stretch of not moving on the train had settled it in like old debt. She breathed through it and thought. She was not getting on a train back to Iowa. There was no Iowa to go back to. Daniel's brother had the house. Daniel's mother had made her position clear 6 months after the funeral, with a particular silence that communicated everything necessary. There was nothing east of here that wanted her, which meant everything she needed was west, or north, or somewhere within reach of this window. She went downstairs before the children woke and found Mrs. Parrish in the kitchen. "Is there anyone in this area who needs a bookkeeper?" Maggie asked. "Or a teacher?" Mrs. Parrish dried her hands on her apron without hurrying. "Eli Brannick might." She set the cloth down. "Rancher. North Road, 4 miles out. His books are a wreck from what I hear. Been trying to teach his hands himself, and it ain't taking." "Anyone else?" "He's your best option." Mrs. Parrish looked at her steadily. "His wife died in childbirth 5 years back. Baby, too. Hasn't had a woman on the property since." Maggie absorbed that. "You're telling me so I know what I'm walking into." "I'm telling you," Mrs. Parrish said, "so you can decide if you still want to walk into it." Maggie considered it for exactly 3 seconds. "Is the North Road passable?" "For now. Storm's coming Thursday." "Then I'll go today." She went upstairs, put on her better dress, the dark blue wool let out twice at the seams now, pinned her hair tight, told Clara to watch the younger ones, and walked out into the November morning with her ledger under her arm. 4 miles in Wyoming snow was not 4 miles anywhere else. The road was frozen ruts and packed drifts, and the cold came up through her boot soles by the first mile and stopped being something she noticed by the second. Her back, already burning from last night, found a new register of complaint somewhere around mile 3. A deep, grinding pull, low and to the left, that made her breath go short on the uphill stretches. She stopped twice, not to rest, just to breathe. One hand pressed to her side where the baby had started to move again, rolling and pushing, like it objected to the pace. "I know," she said out loud, to no one, to both of them. "Nearly there." The Brannick Ranch came over a low rise in pieces. Barn first, massive and tight. Then the bunkhouse with its chimney smoke. Then the main house, 2 stories, white paint long since worn to bare gray wood. Every building squared and solid, and built to last rather than impress. 2 men near the corral stopped working when they saw her on the road. One disappeared into the barn. The other just watched. By the time she reached the gate, a man had come out onto the main house porch. He stood with his arms at his sides. Didn't come toward her, didn't retreat. Just watched her come up the road with the particular stillness of a man who'd learned that most things worth knowing revealed themselves if you waited long enough. Tall, lean in the way of work, not idleness. Dark hair silvering at the temples, a face the weather had worked on thoroughly, a scar along his jaw from something old enough to have settled in. His eyes. She couldn't read the color from this distance, but the attention in them was absolute. Fixed, without any attempt at subtlety, on her belly. She stopped at the foot of his porch steps. "Mr. Brannock?" "That's right." Low voice, unhurried. "My name is Margaret Calloway. I understand you may need a bookkeeper and a teacher." She held up the ledger. "I'd like to talk to you about the position." He looked at her belly, then back at her face. "I don't have work for a woman in your condition." Not mean, not cruel, just flat, like he was stating weather. Maggie climbed the 2 steps, walked to the porch railing, and set the ledger down between them. "Read that," she said. "Then say it again." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. She held his eyes and did not move, and did not look away. He picked up the ledger. He read, standing there in the cold, turning pages the way a man reads when he's actually looking, and not performing the act of looking. Slow, going back, running one finger down the columns. He spent a long time on the final year. He went back twice to her notes in the margin. He was quiet for so long, she counted her own heartbeats in the silence. 4 months, he said, without looking up. 6. He turned another page. The Miller household. You cut their costs 31%. 28 the first year, 31 the second. He closed the ledger. He didn't hand it back yet. He looked out at the yard, at the bunkhouse, at the 2 men near the corral who would stop pretending to work. He looked at the sky, which had gone from white to something lower and heavier in the last hour. "How many children?" he said. 3 with me, 1 coming." He was quiet another long moment. "Storm hits Thursday," he said, still looking at the sky. "That's what Mrs. Parrish told me." "You'd need to be settled before then." "Yes." He handed her the ledger back. "Kitchen's on the left," he said. He opened the door and went inside. Maggie followed. The kitchen was cold, smelled of burnt coffee and neglect. A week of muddy boot prints dried permanent into the floor. Eli didn't apologize for any of it. He put the coffee pot on, decent majestic range, good firebox, and sat at the table. "What happened?" he said. "2? The man who sent for you. He died before I arrived. His brother met me at the train." She sat across from him, hands folded over the ledger. "He's given me until the end of the week." "And before Wyoming?" "My husband died 14 months ago. Mining accident." She said it clean, no ornamentation. "His family took the property. I have 3 children and a 4th coming, and I answered the best advertisement I could find." Eli looked at the table between them for a moment. "Ruth Many Horses," he said. "You know her?" "I've heard the name. I was told she's the midwife." "She's good." Something moved briefly in his face at that, too quick to identify. "Baby's positioned right?" Maggie looked at him carefully. "As far as I know." He nodded, got up, poured coffee into 2 tin cups, put one in front of her without asking, sat back down. $20 a month, he said. "Room and board for you and the children. East wing of the main house. Lock on the door, keyed from inside." He looked at her directly. "Any man tries that door without invitation, he's gone that same day. No discussion." 25, Maggie said. 22. 23. Sundays half days. First month in advance. He studied her across the table. This woman who had walked 4 miles in November snow, 6 months pregnant, to sit in his cold kitchen and negotiate salary with both hands folded, calm as a schoolteacher, on a ledger that had just told him everything he needed to know about her. "Done," he said. He walked to the cabinet beside the range and pulled out a brass key, worn smooth from long use, and set it on the table between them. "Your things are in town. My children are in town. A 9-year-old is watching them." He put on his coat and hat without another word and walked out the back door. She heard him call something to the man near the barn, heard the sound of a wagon being hitched. Maggie sat alone in the cold kitchen. She picked up the brass key, heavy for its size, cold in her palm. She closed her fingers around it, and she breathed, really breathed, for the first time since Silas Holt had turned that lock on the other side of the door. She stood up, rinsed both cups in the dry sink, set them upside down on the board to drain. That was where you started, with whatever was right in front of you that needed doing. Outside, snow was picking up again. Steady, quiet, covering the ruts in the yard. Through the kitchen window, she could see Eli bringing the wagon around from the barn. Could see the 2 men near the corral watching him, watching the house, trying to understand what had just changed. She didn't know yet what Silas had already done that morning. Didn't know he'd walked into the sheriff's office before she'd finished her first cup of Mrs. Parrish's coffee and filed paperwork claiming misrepresentation. That she had come to Wyoming under false pretenses. That she owed the Holt estate for travel costs arranged under fraudulent circumstances. Didn't know the papers would arrive in 4 days, right at the front edge of the worst blizzard Clearwater had seen in 11 years, when the roads would be buried and the temperature would fall to 20 below, and the only people within 4 miles in any direction would be her, 3 children, 5 ranch hands, and a man who had put his wife and their baby in the same grave, and had never once in 5 years spoken a word about it to anyone. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was the weight of a brass key and the sound of wagon wheels coming around from the barn. And for this moment, in this cold kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and something that might yet become a second chance, that was enough. The baby kicked, hard, decisive. She pressed her hand flat to her side and almost smiled. "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." The wagon ride back to Clearwater took 40 minutes in silence, and Maggie didn't try to fill it. Eli drove with his eyes on the road and his hands easy on the reins, and she sat beside him with the brass key in her coat pocket and watched the flat, white prairie move past, and let him be whatever kind of quiet he needed to be. It was Clara who broke it, finally, though not the way Maggie expected. They found the 3 children waiting on the boarding house steps, Rose and Henry bundled together like a 2-headed thing under Maggie's spare coat. Clara standing in front of them with her arms crossed and her chin up, watching the wagon come down the street with the expression of someone who had appointed herself in charge and intended to be consulted about any changes to that arrangement. She looked at Eli the way she looked at mathematics problems she hadn't decided yet whether to trust. Eli looked back at her from the wagon seat without expression. "This your girl?" he said quietly to Maggie. "My oldest, Clara." He climbed down, came around, and offered Maggie his hand without ceremony. She took it, brief, practical, and stepped down, and by the time she'd turned around, Clara had already catalogued everything about Eli Brannock that 9 years of watching her mother navigate difficult men had taught her to look for. "You're the rancher," Clara said. "That's right." "You're going to let us stay?" "Clara," Maggie said, "it's a fair question." Eli looked at Clara directly, which most men didn't bother to do with children. "Yes." Clara considered that. "Why?" "Your mother's books are better than mine." He said it plain, no embellishment, the way he said everything. "Seems like a reasonable trade." Clara looked at her mother. Maggie gave her the small nod that meant, "This is real, and I've thought it through, and you can stand down now." Clara uncrossed her arms. Not all the way, but enough. Henry had no such reservations. He climbed off the step and walked directly to Eli and looked up at him from approximately the height of his belt buckle. "Are you a cowboy?" he asked. "Something like that." "Do you have horses?" "Several." Henry turned to Maggie with the particular urgency of a 4-year-old who has just received the best news of his life. "Mama, horses!" "I heard," Maggie said. They loaded the carpetbags into the wagon bed. There wasn't much, which had stopped embarrassing Maggie sometime around the Nebraska border, and had simply become a fact. And Mrs. Parrish came to the door while they were finishing. She looked at Eli with something in her face that wasn't quite surprise. "Brannock," she said. "Mrs. Parrish," he touched his hat. "You treating her fair?" "Aim to." Mrs. Parrish looked at Maggie for a moment, the sharp-eyed look of a woman taking inventory. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pressed a folded paper into Maggie's hand. "Ruth Many Horses comes through on Thursdays," she said quietly. "I'll send word ahead. She'll stop at the ranch first." Maggie closed her fingers around the paper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Mrs. Parrish glanced once more at Eli, then back at Maggie. "Just take care of that baby." They were on the North Road by noon. Rose fell asleep against Maggie's side within the first mile, exhausted and warm, under the blanket Eli had produced from somewhere under the wagon seat without comment. Henry sat between Eli and Maggie and asked questions about horses, cattle, whether coyotes were friendly, what the biggest snowstorm Eli had ever seen looked like, and whether the ranch had a dog. Eli answered each one in the same measured, unhurried way, as if a 4-year-old's questions deserved the same consideration as anyone else's. Clara sat in the wagon bed behind them, and Maggie could feel her listening to every word. The ranch looked different arriving with the children than it had arriving alone. The 2 men near the corral had multiplied to 4, all of them watching the wagon come through the gate with the particular attention of men who understand that a woman and children on a working ranch means something is about to change, and aren't certain yet whether that change is welcome. Eli pulled up in the yard and climbed down and turned to face them. "Tommy," he said. The youngest of them, 17 at most, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to look like, stepped forward. "Yes, sir." "Help with the bags, East Wing rooms." "Yes, sir." Tommy moved to the wagon bed, then stopped when he caught Clara watching him with that evaluating stare. He straightened slightly. "I'll be careful with your things, miss." Clara blinked, apparently not having expected courtesy. "Thank you," she said, in the precise tone of someone practicing it. The oldest hand, a man with a face like weathered leather and gray hair pulled back at his neck, stepped forward and took off his hat. "Ma'am, I'm Hector. Been on this ranch 11 years. He said it like a credential, like he wanted her to know there was history here and he was part of it, and he was watching to see whether she understood what that meant. "Hector," Maggie looked at him steadily. "Do you read?" He blinked. "Some." "Better than some," said another man from behind him. Maggie looked at him, 30s, dark-eyed, with a careful stillness about him. "I'm Davis. I read fine." "Good." She looked at the group of them. "I'll need someone who can read to help me cross-reference purchasing records this week, before the storm hits." Hector put his hat back on slowly. The men exchanged a look that Maggie didn't try to interpret. Eli said nothing, just walked toward the house, which she was beginning to understand was how he indicated that something had been decided, and the discussion portion was over. Inside, the east wing was 2 rooms side by side off a narrow hallway, bigger than she'd expected, cold but dry, with a window in each that faced the back of the property. Bare walls, plank floors, A dresser in the larger room. 2 narrow beds pushed together in the smaller one. A small iron stove in the corner of the first room, unlit. Tommy set the bags down with genuine care, and then stood in the doorway looking uncertain about whether to leave. "What do you read?" Clara asked him, still in that testing tone. "Newspapers mostly. Some books." He glanced at Eli's departing back in the hall. "Mr. Brannock's been teaching us. 2 hours on Sunday mornings." Clara looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at the small iron stove. "Is there wood?" she asked Tommy. "I'll get some right now, ma'am." He was gone before she finished the sentence. She got the children settled, Rose and Henry in the smaller room, already claiming territories the way children do. Henry immediately investigating under both beds. Rose arranging her 3 remaining possessions on the dresser with tremendous seriousness. And then she stood in the larger room alone for 30 seconds and let herself feel the weight of the day. The brass key was still in her coat pocket. She took it out, walked to the door, turned the lock from the inside. The mechanism was smooth, well made, recently oiled. Somebody had made sure it worked before she got here. She unlocked it, put the key in the dresser drawer, and went to find the kitchen. The state of Eli Brannock's accounts was worse than she'd expected, and more coherent than it looked. She spent the first evening after supper, a meal she'd cooked herself because the alternative was whatever Hector had been boiling in that pot, which had the color and consistency of something that had given up hope. Going through the ledger at the kitchen table, while the children slept and the ranch settled into the night sounds around her. The bones were there. She could see them underneath the chaos, the scratched-out entries and the water-stained pages and the numbers written over other numbers. This was a profitable operation, being quietly eaten from the inside by bad record-keeping, and, if she was reading what she thought she was reading, something worse than bad record-keeping. She went back 6 months, then 8, then a full year. She got up, found a clean sheet of paper in the kitchen drawer, sharpened a pencil, and started a separate column. Eli came in sometime around 9 o'clock, boots quiet on the floor, and stopped when he saw her at the table. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." She didn't look up. "Sit down." He sat. "Your purchasing records and your bank deposits don't match." She turned the ledger so he could see the columns she'd drawn. "Not by accident. The gaps are consistent. Same amounts, same intervals, same method of recording. Somebody's been doing this long enough that it became a habit." Eli looked at the numbers. His jaw tightened in a way she was already learning to read. "How long?" "At least 8 months that I can trace. Could be longer if earlier records are missing." She set her pencil down. "Who handled the books before me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Man named Garrett. Left in September." "Did he leave, or did you let him go?" Another pause. "He left. Said he had family in Colorado." He looked at the columns again. "I thought the account seemed short, but I don't read numbers the way you do." "You read them fine," Maggie said. "You just didn't have enough clean information to build a case." She tapped the paper. "I can build one. Give me 3 days with the store records from town, and I can show you exactly where every missing dollar went." Eli sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the wind had picked up and was moving through the yard with serious intent. The storm that Mrs. Parrish had promised for Thursday was making its intentions known a day early. "You said 3 days," he said. "Storm's coming tomorrow night." "Then I'll go in the morning." "Roads will be bad by noon." "Then I'll go early." He looked at her across the table. "You walked 4 miles in the snow this morning." "And I'm still here." She met his eyes. "Mr. Brannock, someone has been stealing from you for 8 months and covering it well enough that you couldn't prove it. I can prove it." But I need those store records before the storm buries this road for a week. And I need them before Silas Holt does whatever he's planning to do next. Because when a man files paperwork on a Monday morning, before the ink on the arrangement that threatens him is even dry, he's not finished. She folded her hands on the table. So I'll go early, and I'll be back before noon, and the storm can do whatever it likes after that. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Davis can drive you, Eli said. He knows that road in bad weather. He pushed back from the table, stopped, looked at the ledger, then at her work on the separate sheet of paper. The clean columns, the clear documentation of someone's long and careful theft. Garrett, he said, mostly to himself. 8 months. At least. He nodded once, slow, and walked toward the door. Mr. Brannock? He stopped. She said it because it needed saying, and she'd rather say it plainly now than have it come out sideways later. I don't know yet if the person who's been stealing is still on this ranch. He turned. His face was very still. It could be someone from outside, she said. It could be Garrett working with someone he left behind. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm telling you what the numbers suggest, which is that whoever it was knew your operation, knew your records, and knew when you were unlikely to be checking. She held his eyes. That's not a stranger. The wind moved hard against the kitchen window. Eli stood in the doorway for a long moment with a lamp behind him, and his shadow was long across the floor. And he was as unreadable as he'd been on the porch that morning when he'd looked at her belly and said he didn't have work for a woman in her condition. I hear you, he said, and went. Maggie sat alone in the kitchen. The baby shifted, a long, slow movement, rolling from one side to the other, like it was getting comfortable for the night. She pressed her hand flat against her side and sat with the quiet for a minute. Just that. Just the sound of the wind and the lamp burning low, and 3 children asleep down the hall. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the numbers. Davis woke her at 5:30 the next morning with a knock on the east wing door and the information that the sky was doing something he didn't like the look of, and they should leave within the hour. Maggie was dressed in 7 minutes, had the children briefed, and instructions left with Tommy, who had apparently been voluntold for child-watching duty, and accepted this with the resignation of someone who understood it was not a negotiation, and was in the wagon by 6. The trip to Clearwater took 35 minutes. Davis was a man of limited conversation, and she appreciated it. The cold was serious, the sky was the color of iron, and the wind was already doing things that made the wagon creak on the straight stretches. Morrison's Mercantile opened at 7. Maggie was at the counter at 7 past, and the man behind it, heavy through the middle, with eyes that moved to the door and back to her twice in the first minute, was already uncomfortable before she said a word. I need to see the Turner Ranch account records, she said. I'm sorry, Brannock. The Brannock Ranch account records. She had said the wrong name. An old name. Someone else's name from somewhere in the back of her memory. She filed that away and moved past it. Morrison pulled out the ledger without much argument. She had Eli's written authorization in her coat pocket, signed that morning before they left, and set it on the counter, and watched her read with the expression of a man who was trying to determine whether he was in trouble and how much. She found it in 11 minutes. Purchases charged to the Brannock account and signed for. Tobacco, ammunition, 2 saddles, a quantity of rope that had never appeared in the ranch records. The signatures were consistent. She pulled out her notebook and compared them to the samples she'd brought from Eli's ledger. Not Garrett. The handwriting was different. Looser, younger, with a particular way of looping the tail on the letter G that she'd seen somewhere in the last 16 hours. She stood very still at Morrison's counter and thought about Tommy, who was 17 years old and minding her children, and about Davis, who was waiting in the wagon outside, and about the fact that a boy who read newspapers and was learning from Eli Brannick on Sunday mornings, and who had straightened up when Clara looked at him and called her miss. That boy could be desperate in ways that a person with enough to eat and a solid roof over their head sometimes forgot to account for. She closed her notebook. "Mr. Morrison?" She kept her voice neutral. "These 3 purchases from September and October. Do you have the delivery records? Who collected the goods?" Morrison went pale, in the particular way of men who know exactly what you're about to find, and have been hoping you wouldn't look. He went through the motions of checking, though. Took long enough at it that she had time to decide what she was going to do before he confirmed what she already knew. The name written in the delivery log was not Garrett's. She paid Morrison for copies of the relevant pages, put them in her coat, and walked back out to Davis and the wagon without her face showing a thing. "Ready?" Davis asked. "Ready." She climbed up. The wind hit her full in the face, and the first real snow of the storm, heavy, serious snow, not the light, powdery kind, was beginning to come down. "Let's get back before this gets worse." Davis turned the wagon north, without another word. Maggie sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and the notebook against her side, and thought about how you handled the information that someone young and probably scared had been stealing from the man who was currently the only reason her children had a roof and a locked door and a future in Wyoming. She thought about what justice looked like when it had a 17-year-old face and a pair of eyes that went careful and respectful when a 9-year-old girl looked at him sideways. She thought about what her own mother would have said, and about what Daniel would have said, and about what Eleanor Price, if Eleanor Price had been a real woman and not just the shape of a story she told herself on hard nights, would have done. The ranch appeared over the rise through the thickening snow, solid and certain against the white. Smoke from the bunkhouse chimney, smoke from the main house, the sound of the horses in the barn already restless with the pressure change that came before real weather. Eli was standing on the porch when they pulled in. He looked at her face, and then at the snow, and then at her face again. "Did you find what you needed?" he said. "Yes." She climbed down. Her back was a sustained complaint, and the baby had been pushing against her left side for the last hour, and the cold had found every gap in her coat. "I need to talk to you. Not outside." He held the door. She walked into the kitchen, which was warm now, properly warm, and she could hear Clara's voice from somewhere down the hall. Not upset, just talking. That particular cadence she used when she was explaining something she considered important. And Henry laughing at something. And the ordinary sounds of a house that was, improbably, beginning to sound like somewhere people lived. She took off her coat, set the notebook on the table, and turned to face Eli Brannick. "Close the door," she said. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult." Eli closed the door. He didn't ask questions first, didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance or preparation. He just pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down and waited. Which she was learning was the most distinctly Eli Brannick thing he did. That absolute, unhurried waiting. Like he'd decided long ago that most of the world's mistakes came from people who couldn't stand to let a thing arrive at its own pace. Maggie set the notebook open on the table between them. "The signatures on the Morrison account don't match Garrett," she said. "They match someone here." Eli looked at the notebook. He looked at the careful comparison she'd drawn, the 2 sets of handwriting side by side, the specific inconsistencies circled, the dates annotated in the margin. He was quiet for a long moment. "Tommy," he said, not a question. "Yes?" He sat back in his chair. He didn't say anything for long enough that the storm outside filled the silence. Wind working at the eaves, snow beginning to collect against the kitchen window. The particular sound of serious winter weather settling in for a real stay. "How much?" he said finally. 60, maybe $70 total." spread over 4 months, which is why it was easy to miss. She closed the notebook. He was careful about it, not greedy. Small amounts, long intervals. Someone taught him to do it that way, or he figured it out himself, which in some ways is worse because it means he thought it through. He came to me 2 years ago, Eli said. His voice was very even. 14 years old, sleeping in Morrison's barn. Parents died of fever the winter before. He had nothing. He put both hands flat on the table. Nothing. I know. I paid for his boots, his first winter coat. He looked at the wall above her head. Hector taught him to rope. Davis taught him to read brands. I've been teaching him Sunday mornings for 18 months. I know, Maggie said again, quieter. Why? It came out rough, like it had been stored somewhere painful. If he needed money, why didn't he just... Because he didn't think he could ask. She watched his face. Mr. Brannock, how do you ask the man who gave you boots and Sunday school lessons to give you more? What language does a 16-year-old orphan use for that conversation? He probably told himself he'd pay it back before you noticed. She paused. He probably still believes he will. Eli was quiet. Outside in the hall, Henry's laughter sounded again, high and uncomplicated. And then Clara's voice, lower, patient, explaining something. And then Tommy's laugh responding, easy and young. The laugh of a boy who didn't know yet that the woman who'd arrived yesterday with her ledger and her careful eyes had just put his name on a piece of paper with a circle around it. Eli heard it too. She watched him hear it. What do you want to do? She said. He looked at her. You're asking me? It's your ranch, your money, your decision. You found it. That doesn't make it mine to decide. She folded her hands on the table. But I'll tell you what I think, if you want it. Say it. Don't go to the sheriff. She said it plainly. Not yet. Not first. $60 is cattle theft territory in Wyoming territory, and that boy is 17 years old. You send him to prison over $60, and you're the one who has to live with that. She held his eyes. Confront him. Give him the chance to tell you the truth. If he tells the truth, you figure out a repayment arrangement, and you make it clear that the next dishonesty, for any reason, for any amount, ends differently. She paused. And then you find out why he needed the money, because it wasn't for tobacco and ammunition. Boys that age don't steal for things they want. They steal for things they need. Eli absorbed that. And if he lies, he said, then you have a different conversation. He pushed back from the table and stood and went to the window. The snow was coming down hard now, the yard barely visible, the bunkhouse just a smear of light and shadow at the far side. He stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, and Maggie let him stand, didn't try to move him forward. He'd arrive at his own pace, or he wouldn't, and either way, she'd said what she came inside to say. After supper, he said finally, not in front of the others. That's right. He turned from the window. His face had settled into something that wasn't anger exactly. It was the expression of a man absorbing a specific kind of grief. The grief of discovering that someone you decided to trust had been carrying something alone that you might have helped carry differently. You should eat something, and rest if you can before... The front door opened with a bang that sent it back against the wall, and Hector came in with snow on every surface of him, and his face arranged in the particular way of a man delivering bad news he's been rehearsing since the gate. Sheriff's deputy, he said. Came up the north road just before the storm closed it. He's got papers. Maggie was already on her feet. Eli had already turned. In the front hallway, the deputy, young, cold, thoroughly unhappy about being on the north road in a blizzard, stood with his hat in his hands and a sealed envelope that had the county clerk's seal on the front, and Maggie's name written in handwriting she recognized. Silas Holt's handwriting. She took it, broke the seal, read it twice. "What is it?" Eli said from behind her. "He's filed a civil complaint." She kept her voice even. "Claims I misrepresented my circumstances to his brother in order to obtain travel funds and a promise of property. Claims the letters I wrote constituted fraudulent inducement." She folded the paper precisely along its original creases. "He's requesting the court compel me to repay the cost of my train passage and award damages for—" She checked the paper again. "Emotional distress suffered by the Holt family due to my deceptive conduct." "Emotional distress," Eli said. "That's what it says." The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm required to inform you that you're requested to appear before Judge Alderman on Friday morning. Given the weather—" He glanced at the door, at the snow driving past it. "He may delay, but I can't promise that." "I understand." Maggie handed the deputy the folded paper back. "Tell the judge I'll be there Friday, weather permitting, and that I'll be bringing documentation." The deputy left. Hector closed the door. The hallway felt smaller in the silence that followed. "Fraudulent inducement," Eli said. His voice had gone very flat. "He needs the property sold quickly. If I have any claim on it, even an informal one, even just the claim of a woman who came in good faith based on written promises, it clouds the title. A buyer won't take a clouded title." She walked back toward the kitchen. "He needs me gone and discredited." "You have the letters?" "Every one of them. Franklin's handwriting, dated. The last one written 4 weeks before he died, reaffirming his intention to marry me." She went to the carpet bag she'd left in the corner and pulled out the bundle. 12 letters, tied with kitchen string, worn at the edges from being read many times on many dark nights. She set them on the table. "And I have the advertisement he placed, which I answered in writing and kept a copy of, and the documentation of the travel arrangements he made on my behalf." She sat down. "Silas is betting I'm too frightened, too alone, and too close to my time to fight it. He's betting I'll take whatever small payment he offers to make it go away and get back on a train." Eli sat down across from her. He looked at the letters, then at her face. "Are you frightened?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "I'm also not getting on a train." Something shifted in his face. It wasn't a smile. She wasn't certain Eli Brannock's face knew the full mechanics of a smile. But it was something adjacent to respect, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. "You'll need a lawyer," he said. "I know a little law. Enough." Knowing a little law and standing in front of Judge Alderman are different things. "Do you know a lawyer?" "In Clearwater, no. There's one in Benton, 2 hours east, when the roads are passable." He looked out the window at the storm. "Which they won't be Friday. Then I'll stand in front of Judge Alderman myself." She said it simply, the way she said most things. "I've read the territorial statutes on breach of promise and property rights. A woman who comes to a territory in good faith, based on written documentation of a man's intent, is not a fraud. She's a creditor." She tapped the letters. "And I have better documentation than Silas Holt does." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "You read territorial statutes?" "I was on a train for 3 days. I had time." "You read Wyoming territorial statutes on a train?" "I read everything I could find before I left Iowa about the legal status of women in Western territories. It seemed relevant." She met his eyes steadily. "I was traveling alone with 3 children and another coming to marry a man I'd never met, Mr. Brannock. I did not do that without preparation." He was quiet again. Then, without preamble, "My lawyer is in Cheyenne. I'll send a wire tomorrow morning if the telegraph line is still up. He can send a written brief that you can present to Alderman on Friday. It won't replace being there, but Alderman respects Calhoun's opinion, and it might be enough to get a delay. Maggie looked at him. Thank you. You're documenting my accounts, he said. Seems like the least I can do. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was the Eli Brannick version of warmth, which was practical and proportional, and didn't announce itself. And she was beginning to think it might be more reliable than the announced kind. Supper that night was quieter than the night before. The storm had locked them all in, all 6 ranch hands, Maggie, the 3 children, and the particular tension of people who didn't yet know how to be together in a confined space through bad weather. Hector ate steadily and said nothing. Davis read at his end of the table between bites. The 2 hands she hadn't learned the names of yet, she'd fix that by tomorrow, she decided, ate quickly and retreated to the bunkhouse. Henry fell asleep in his chair before dessert and had to be carried to bed by Maggie, with considerably more effort than it had required a month ago, the baby making every lift and bend a negotiation. Tommy cleared the table without being asked. It was the kind of thing a boy did when he was managing guilt. Useful, visible, making himself valuable before the reckoning arrived. She recognized it. She'd seen it in students who hadn't done their assignments and were hoping helpfulness might serve as currency. She watched him stack the plates and thought about what she'd said to Eli. She thought about what it cost a 17-year-old boy to steal from the man who'd given him his first winter coat. Clara appeared at her elbow. "Mama, the baby's been moving a lot." "I know. Is that bad?" "No, sweetheart. It means she's strong." She smoothed Clara's hair back. "Go to bed. I'll be in soon." "She?" Clara looked up sharply. "You said she." Maggie paused. "I don't know. It felt like a she tonight." Clara considered this with tremendous seriousness. "I've thought it was a she since Omaha," she said, and went to bed with the air of someone whose instincts had just been validated. Eli came to find her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, when the dishes were done and Tommy was putting away the last of the cups. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Tommy. He said, "Tommy, when you're done, come to the study." Tommy set the last cup down very carefully. He didn't look at Maggie. "Yes, sir." She went to check on the children. She sat on the edge of the bed, where Rose and Clara were already half asleep, and listened to Henry's small, even breathing from across the room, and felt the baby move, that same slow rolling she'd been feeling since Cheyenne, strong and steady and stubbornly present. She put her hand flat on her side and sat on the dock for a while. Through the wall, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the study. Not the words, just the rhythm. Eli's voice first, measured and deliberate. Then silence. Then Tommy's voice. And even through the wall and across the hall, she could hear the exact moment it broke. The catch in it that wasn't quite crying, but was the thing that came right before. She closed her eyes. The voices went on for a long time. At one point, there was a longer silence, and she imagined Eli sitting across from that boy the way he sat across from everyone, absolutely still, letting the thing arrive at its own pace, not filling the silence because he knew that sometimes the silence was where the truth lived. When the study door finally opened, she heard one set of footsteps go down the hall toward the bunkhouse. She heard the other set come toward the kitchen. She found Eli standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, looking out at nothing but snow and his own reflection. "Well?" she said. "His sister," Eli said, "in Laramie. 14 years old, working in a laundry house since last spring. He's been sending her money every month." Didn't want to ask me because... He stopped. Started again. He said he didn't know if I'd think it was his problem to solve. Maggie sat down at the table. He cried, Eli said, to the window. I haven't seen that boy cry since the first winter he was here, when his horse got sick and he thought it was going to die. He set the coffee cup down. He told me the truth. Everything. Down to the exact amount. What did you tell him? Told him the stealing stops. Told him he works off the debt over the next 6 months, dollar by dollar, and every dollar is documented in your books, so there's no confusion about where it stands. He turned from the window. And I told him his sister can come here in the spring. There's room in the east wing once... He stopped. Once the baby comes, he didn't say. Once the weather clears, he said instead. Maggie looked at him standing there in his kitchen in the middle of a blizzard, with his cold coffee and his careful face, and she thought about the box she'd noticed on the shelf in the hallway. Small, wooden, ordinary, and about what Mrs. Parrish had said about a man who'd buried his wife and baby in the same grave and hadn't had a woman on his property in 5 years. She thought about what it costs a person to remain capable of that kind of practical, unannounced generosity after that kind of loss. That was well done, she said. He shrugged, the small, dismissive movement of a man who didn't know how to accept that kind of remark. He's a good boy. He is. And you're a good... She stopped herself, recalibrated. You handled it well. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted the way it had shifted twice before. That recalculation, that careful adjustment, like a man who had built himself a very specific way of being in the world and was encountering something that didn't quite fit the architecture. The papers tomorrow, he said. I'll send the wire to Calhoun first thing. Thank you. Get some sleep. He picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. Ruth Many Horses will come through tomorrow if the storm breaks enough. Mrs. Parrish would have sent word ahead like she said. Maggie stood. Her back was a sustained argument at this point. The baby pressed low and heavy, and the day had been long enough to count for 3. Mr. Brannock, he looked at her. If Ruth tells you something about the baby's position that concerns you, I want to be there for that conversation. Whatever she says, I want to hear it directly. He was still for a moment. All right. I'm not fragile. I'm just very tired and very pregnant. And those are different things. I know the difference, he said quietly. And there was something in those 4 words that meant more than 4 words could usually carry. Something about what he'd learned the hard way, about the distance between fragile and tired. And she understood enough now to not push past it. Good night, Mr. Brannock. Good night, Mrs. Calloway. She went down the hall. Through the east wing door, which she locked from the inside with the brass key, and then stood for a moment in the dark room, listening to her children breathe. Clara, slow and steady. Rose, slightly congested, the small whistle that meant she needed another blanket. Henry, completely abandoned to sleep, the way only 4-year-olds could be, arms thrown wide, boots still on. She pulled Henry's boots off in the dark without waking him, and covered him with the extra blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed, and stood there in the dark, and thought about Friday, and Judge Alderman, and Silas Holt's careful, calculated paperwork. Thought about Tommy's sister and Laramie. Thought about Ruth Many Horses, who was coming tomorrow, who would put her hands on Maggie's belly and tell her what she most needed and most feared to hear. The baby moved. That same rolling, that same pressure against the left side, the same stubborn, communicative presence that had been keeping her company since somewhere before the Nebraska border. She pressed both hands flat and held them there. Outside, the storm wasn't done. The wind was working hard at the eaves, the snow still coming, the world outside the east wing window a solid, impenetrable white. But the walls around her were solid too, built by a man who knew how to build for weather. And the lock on the door was good. And down the hall, a boy who'd stolen $60 for his sister was probably lying awake in the bunkhouse, deciding what kind of person he was going to be from here forward. She was not on a train. She was not in Iowa. She was not in a boarding house with $3 left. She was here, and here had a locked door, and a kitchen that smelled like supper, and a man in the next room who had just told a grieving, guilty boy that his sister could come in the spring. That was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. She got into bed, turned on her side the way she had to sleep now, and closed her eyes. The baby settled. The storm pushed at the walls and found them sound. And somewhere between one breath and the next, for the first time since the train left Omaha, Maggie Calloway slept without listening for what was coming next. Ruth Many Horses arrived the next morning while the storm was still deciding whether it was finished. She came on horseback, which said something about her, and she came alone, which said more. She was somewhere past 50, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough of the world's worst moments to have stopped being surprised by them and started being useful instead. She tied her horse at the post without waiting for anyone to offer, came through the front door when Hector opened it, looked at the assembled ranch hands with the expression of a woman who had very little patience for being stared at, and said, "Where is she?" Hector looked at Eli. Eli looked down the hall. Maggie had heard the horse. She was already in the kitchen doorway, with her hands folded in front of her, having decided sometime around 4 in the morning that whatever Ruth Many Horses had to tell her, she would hear it standing up. Ruth looked at her. Just looked, for a moment, the way certain people looked when they were reading something the rest of the world couldn't see. "You're further along than 6 months," Ruth said. 7, maybe. I may have miscounted." "You didn't miscount." Ruth set her bag on the kitchen table. "Come sit down." Eli was in the doorway. Maggie had asked him to be there, and he was there, arms at his sides, face giving nothing away. Ruth glanced at him once, a glance that contained an entire conversation that Maggie wasn't privy to, and then turned her full attention back to Maggie. The examination was thorough and unhurried. Ruth's hands were certain, practiced, communicating a kind of knowledge that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with years. She pressed and measured and listened and said nothing for a long time, and Maggie watched her face and tried to read it the way she read ledgers, looking for the pattern underneath the surface numbers. When Ruth finally sat back, she looked at Maggie directly. "The baby is positioned correctly," she said. "Head down, well settled, strong heartbeat." Maggie let out a breath she had been holding since Omaha. "But you're carrying low," Ruth continued, "and this baby is not waiting until March." "How long?" 6 weeks, maybe less. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "This your 4th?" "Yes." 4th babies come faster than people expect. Your body knows what it's doing, but it won't ask permission. She looked at Maggie steadily. "You need to stop doing whatever it is you were planning to do that involves riding in wagons in blizzards." "I have a court appearance Friday." Ruth looked at Eli. Eli looked at the wall above Maggie's head, which she was learning was what he did when he was exercising restraint. "1 wagon ride," Ruth said, "to the courthouse and back. Nothing more strenuous than that until this baby comes." She reached into her bag and produced a small cloth bundle, knotted at the top. "Red raspberry leaf. Brew it as tea, 1 cup in the evening. It won't slow anything down, but it'll make the work easier when the time comes." She set it on the table. "I'll come back in 2 weeks. If anything changes before then, If the pain shifts from your back to the front, if it comes in intervals, if your water breaks, you send someone for me immediately, day or night." "I understand." Ruth stood. She looked at Eli again with that same unreadable look. "She needs to eat more than she's eating," she said. "I can tell." "I eat fine," Maggie said. "You eat enough to keep yourself functional," Ruth said. "That's not the same thing." She picked up her bag. "There's two of you." She left the same way she'd come, without ceremony, and they heard her horse moving away through the snow before the front door had finished closing. Maggie sat at the kitchen table and let the silence settle around her. 6 weeks, maybe less. She did the arithmetic. Friday's court appearance, the ongoing account work, the Silas situation, Tommy's debt documentation, the winter store's inventory she'd already started cataloging in her head because she couldn't help it. And she rearranged the order of urgency with the calm of someone who had learned that panicking was just thinking with worse information. Eli came back into the kitchen and sat across from her. 6 weeks, he said. Yes, in this house. If you're asking whether that changes our arrangement, the answer is no. She looked at him. A baby doesn't change my ability to keep your books. I know that. He said it quietly. I know that. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Ruth's good. Best in 3 counties. She's delivered half the children in Clearwater. I know. Mrs. Parrish told me. Maggie folded her hands. Mr. Brannock, I need you to tell me what you're actually thinking, not what you think I need to hear. He looked at her. The morning light through the kitchen window was thin and white, and it showed every line in his face, every year of weather and work and whatever it was he carried quietly and continuously, without apparent complaint. My wife was strong, he said, stronger than most. She wasn't frightened of anything, right up until... He stopped, started again. Strength doesn't always... Another stop. He looked at the table. I'm not very good at this. You're doing fine, Maggie said. I just mean I'm aware that things can go wrong that have nothing to do with strength or preparation or anything a person did or didn't do. He said it to the table, flat and careful, like he was reading it off something written there. And I'd rather know that going in than have it surprise me again. The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth isn't worried, Maggie said, and Ruth does not strike me as a woman who hides things to be kind. No, he agreed, she doesn't. So we proceed. She put her hands flat on the table. I'll go to court Friday. I'll present Franklin's letters and the territorial statute on good faith reliance. Calhoun's brief, if the wire goes through today, will support the legal argument. Silas is betting on a frightened woman and a sympathetic judge. I intend to be neither frightened nor requiring of sympathy. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite. Almost. I'll drive you, he said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He stood and put his coffee cup in the dry sink. I'll drive you. She let him. Some arguments were not worth the energy. The wire went through to Cheyenne that afternoon, the telegraph line still intact by some mercy of geography. Eli sent it himself from the bunkhouse office, 4 sentences to Calhoun, the situation laid out with the same economy he used for everything. And Calhoun's reply came back within 2 hours, which meant the man was good and knew it, and worked accordingly. The brief arrived by morning courier on Thursday, a rider who had clearly been paid handsomely to come up the North Road in post-storm conditions, and who looked at the state of the road and the sky with the expression of a man reconsidering his professional choices. Maggie read it at the kitchen table while the children ate breakfast, and she read it twice, and then she set it down and thought about it for a moment. Calhoun had found the territorial statute she'd found on the train. He'd also found 2 others she hadn't. One of them was significantly better than anything she'd located herself. A precedent case from 1879. A woman in a near-identical situation who had successfully argued that written promises constituting an offer and written acceptance constituting a contract created enforceable obligations, regardless of the absence of a formal marriage agreement. She went to find Eli. He was in the barn with Davis, working on something with a fence post that required both of them and a significant amount of focused effort. She waited in the doorway until there was a natural pause. "Calhoun found a precedent," she said. "Bellingham versus the estate of James Croft, 1879. Woman came to Colorado Territory on the basis of written promises. Court found in her favor." She held up a brief. "Silas doesn't have a case. He has a nuisance filing and a judge who either knows this or will know it when I put this in front of him Friday morning." Eli and Davis exchanged a look. "Good," Eli said. "I thought you'd want to know." I did want to know. He went back to the fence post. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." It was such a complete and unself-conscious response. She had brought him useful information. He had received it as useful information. And now both of them could proceed. That she stood in the barn doorway for a moment longer than necessary, struck by the strange simplicity of being in a place where her competence was just a fact that got acknowledged and incorporated, like a tool that fit the work it was intended for. Davis glanced at her with a carefully neutral expression of a man pretending he hadn't noticed anything. She went back inside. Friday arrived clear and vicious, the sky a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature somewhere below what her body considered reasonable. Eli had the wagon ready at 7:30, horses stamping, breath steaming, the whole operation radiating a kind of efficient disapproval of the cold that she found, for no logical reason, reassuring. Clara met her in the hall with Maggie's heavier coat and a look that communicated everything Clara generally communicated without using words. "I am not pleased about this. I understand it's necessary. I expect you back before supper." "I'll be home before supper," Maggie told her. "I know you will." Clara held the coat while Maggie got into it, which required more cooperation than it once had. "I've been going over the inventory list you started. The salt pork count seems wrong." "It is wrong. I think the September delivery was short. Check it against the Morrison receipt from the file on the kitchen table. Second page, right column." Clara nodded. "Tommy can help me find it." Maggie paused, one button half done. "Is that going well? With Tommy?" "He's teaching Henry to count to 20 in Spanish," Clara said. "Henry thinks it's the best thing that's ever happened to him." She met Maggie's eyes. "And Tommy seems steadier than the first day." "He's working something out," Maggie said. "I know." Clara did the last button herself. "Go, Mama. Don't be late." The road to Clearwater was brutal and beautiful, the snow packed solid and white in every direction, the mountains showing sharp and clear in the cold air. Maggie sat beside Eli with Calhoun's brief inside her coat against her chest, and Franklin's 12 letters in her bag, and watched the miles pass. "Have you appeared before aldermen before?" she asked. "Once. Boundary dispute with the Hendricks place, 3 years back." "What's he like?" Eli considered. "Fair, not fast. He likes documentation more than he likes argument." He glanced at her. "Which suits you." "It does." They rode in silence for a while. A hawk turned slow circles above something in the snow to their left, patient and enormous. "My wife's name was Caroline," Eli said. Maggie was still. "She was from Virginia, came west with her brother in 74. I met her the spring of 75 at a land filing in Clearwater." He kept his eyes on the road. "We were married that October. She was..." She didn't complain about things. Whatever the situation was, she just looked at it until she figured out what it needed, and then she did that. He was quiet for a moment. The baby came early, 6 weeks early. Ruth was there. Ruth did everything right. He paused. Some things can't be fixed by doing everything right. Maggie looked at the road ahead of them. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know." He said it simply, not dismissing the condolence and not requiring anything more from it. "I'm not telling you because I don't want sympathy. I just thought you should know who was in that house before you were, and why the kitchen smells like 2 years of bad cooking, and why there's a box on the hallway shelf that nobody touches." "What's in the box?" she asked it quietly. He was quiet for a long moment. Half a yellow sweater. She was knitting it, never finished. Maggie looked at her hands in her lap. "She would have liked you," Eli said, matter-of-factly. "She had no patience for people who couldn't manage their own affairs. She would have watched you negotiate your salary in my kitchen, and she would have come to find me afterward and told me I was getting the better end of that deal, and I should stop being difficult about it." Maggie almost laughed. It came out smaller than a laugh, more like the shape of one. "Was $23 too high?" "No," he said. "It was exactly right." The courthouse in Clearwater was a building that took itself seriously in a town that hadn't quite decided to yet. Judge Alderman was 60, broad, with the expression of a man who had heard every variation of human foolishness and was prepared to hear several more before lunch. He looked at Maggie when she walked in, at her coat, at her bag, at her belly, and then looked at Eli, who had come in behind her and taken a seat in the gallery, with the deliberate presence of a man establishing a fact without making a speech about it. Silas Holt was already there, at the plaintiff's table, with a man beside him who had "lawyer" written in the cut of his coat and the arrangement of his papers. He looked at Maggie, and then looked at Eli, and something in his expression recalculated. Maggie set Calhoun's brief on the table, set Franklin's 12 letters beside it, bound and dated and annotated, set the advertisement and her written response and the documentation of the travel arrangements. She arranged it all with the same care she arranged figures in a ledger. Clean, precise, impossible to misread. And she sat down and folded her hands and waited. The lawyer beside Silas leaned over and said something in a low voice. Silas shook his head. The lawyer said something again, more insistently, and Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Judge Alderman looked at the documents on Maggie's table. He looked at her. He picked up his glasses, put them on, and read the first page of Calhoun's brief in silence. He read 3 more pages. He set it down. "Mr. Holt," he said, in the tone of a man who has already arrived at a conclusion and is performing the courtesy of the process for the record. "Your counsel has reviewed the Bellingham precedent?" Silas's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we would argue that the Bellingham case presents a materially different set of—" "Sit down, counselor." Not unkind, just final. He looked at Silas. "You sent for this woman in writing. Your brother sent for this woman in writing. She came in documented good faith to a documented promise. She has 12 letters, a signed advertisement, and a brief from Samuel Calhoun of Cheyenne, who knows this territory's law better than anyone in this room, myself included." He took off his glasses. "What exactly did you expect me to do with this case?" Silas sat very still. "I have expenses," he said. "You have a property dispute," Alderman said. "That's a different proceeding, filed differently, with different standing requirements. What you filed here is a harassment action against a pregnant widow, and I won't hear it." He stamped the papers. "Case dismissed. Mrs. Calloway, I'd suggest you consult Mr. Calhoun about your actual property standing if you intend to pursue that matter. which by the look of these letters you have reasonable grounds to do." "Thank you, Your Honor." She gathered her documents with steady hands. Behind her, she heard Eli shift in his seat, the small sound of a man who had been holding himself very still for 30 minutes and was now done with that. Silas stood. For a moment he just stood there, looking at Maggie across the room, and she looked back at him and waited. He had the look of a man who had run out of the particular kind of courage that came from being certain you would win, and was left with nothing but the ordinary kind, which was harder and less reliable. "I needed that property," he said, not to the judge, to her. "I know," she said. "Franklin should have—" He stopped. "He should have told me what he was planning." "He should have," she agreed. "But he didn't, and now we're both managing the consequences of that." She picked up her bag. "I have no interest in taking something that isn't mine, Mr. Holt. I have an interest in not being made destitute in the middle of winter with 4 children, and no fault of my own." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to talk about what Franklin actually intended, you have my direction. We can have that conversation like reasonable people." He said nothing, but something in his face moved. That same hesitation she'd seen on the platform, the single unguarded moment before he'd put his hat back on. And she filed it away. Outside, Eli was already at the wagon. He said nothing about what had happened inside, just checked the harness with the focused attention of a man making sure everything was properly secured before a long drive. Maggie climbed up. He came around and climbed up beside her. She sat there in the cold, brilliant morning, with Calhoun's brief in her bag, and Franklin's letters against her chest, and the baby pressing steady and insistent against her left side. And she felt not victory exactly, something quieter. The specific satisfaction of having prepared well for something difficult and found the preparation sufficient. "Well," Eli said. "Dismissed," she said. He picked up the reins. "I'll wire Calhoun about the property standing." "You don't need to do that." "I know." He looked at her sideways briefly. "I'll do it anyway." She looked at the road home and thought about the inventory list Clara was working through, and the salt pork discrepancy, and the account document she still needed to finish, and Ruth coming back in 2 weeks, and Tommy's sister in Laramie, and the small cloth bundle of red raspberry leaf tea on the kitchen shelf. The drive back was easier than the drive out. The sun had taken some of the edge off the cold, and the road was better in the afternoon light. And somewhere in the first mile, the baby settled into a long, slow stillness that felt like sleep. "Tell me something," Maggie said, halfway home. "What kind of something?" "Something about this place. Something I should know that I don't know yet." He thought about it. The creek on the east boundary runs year-round, even in the worst winters. Good for cattle in a dry spring. He paused. The south pasture floods in April every year, but it dries rich and the grass comes in strong. He paused again. "Tommy can fix a saddle better than anyone I've hired in 10 years, and he doesn't know that about himself yet." She looked at him. "Those are things you should know," he said, "about this place." She turned back to the road. The ranch was just visible now over the last low rise. Smoke from both chimneys, the barn solid against the sky. Everything squared and intentional, and built to outlast the weather around it. "Henry will want to know if he can see the horses tomorrow," she said. "He can," Eli said. "Tell him to ask Hector. Hector's better with children than he looks." She smiled at the road, fully this time, without reservation. "I'll tell him," she said. The 2 weeks between the court dismissal and Ruth's promised return passed the way good working weeks did. Full enough that the days had weight to them, short enough in retrospect that Maggie was surprised each evening to find another one gone. She finished the account documentation on the Monday after the courthouse, laid it out clean and complete on the kitchen table after supper, and walked Eli through it the way she walked her students through a proof. Here is what we know. Here is how we know it. Here is what it means. Garrett had taken $63 over 8 months. Tommy's total was $71, already documented as debt in the new ledger, with the first week's deduction already recorded. The ranch was profitable. Better than profitable, once the middleman commission on cattle sales got renegotiated, which she had already drafted a letter about and needed Eli to sign. He signed it without reading it. "You should read it," she said. "I trust your numbers." "You should still read it." He read it, signed it, handed it back. "Same as what you said." "Yes," she said, "but now you know." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply recognizing. The one that meant he was filing something away in a place he kept private. "You're going to make me read everything, aren't you?" "Every word," she said pleasantly, and went to put the letter with the outgoing mail. The children had settled into the ranch the way children settled into places that had enough space and enough to do. Completely. And with the unself-conscious confidence of people who had decided this was theirs now. Henry had attached himself to Hector with a devotion that Hector bore with the stoic endurance of a man who had raised cattle, and considered this not entirely different in principle. Rose had discovered the kitchen cat, a gray, opinionated animal named Biscuit, who had survived 2 Wyoming winters on pure spite, and had made it her personal mission to convince Biscuit that affection was survivable. Clara had quietly reorganized the kitchen stores, cross-referenced the Morrison receipts, found 2 additional discrepancies Maggie hadn't caught yet, and presented them without fanfare on a Wednesday evening, with the expression of someone who was trying very hard not to look proud of themselves. Maggie had looked at the figures and looked at her daughter and said, "You'd have made a good accountant." Clara had said, "I intend to be a lawyer," in a tone that closed the subject entirely. Tommy had stopped flinching every time Eli walked into a room. It happened gradually enough that Maggie wasn't certain exactly when it shifted. Sometime around the 2nd week, she thought, when Eli had handed Tommy the responsibility for the east pasture fence check without commentary or supervision. The way you handed responsibility to someone you expected to use it right. Tommy had come back and reported accurately and in detail, and Eli had nodded once and said, "Good," and that had apparently been sufficient. She wrote the letter to Tommy's sister in Laramie herself, on a Saturday afternoon while the snow came down soft and purposeless outside the kitchen window. Tommy had given her the address from memory. He'd memorized it, she realized, because he'd never trusted that a piece of paper would stay safe. She wrote that there was room in the spring, that the work was honest and the people were decent, and that her brother was doing well and had asked her to come. She gave it to Tommy to read before she sealed it. He read it standing at the kitchen table, and when he looked up, his face was doing several things at once that he was trying not to show. "This is good," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "Sign it yourself," she said. "She'll want to see your handwriting." He signed it with more care than she'd ever seen him take with anything. The letter went out Monday. By Wednesday, something in Tommy's shoulders had changed. A loosening, a millimeter of weight redistributed. And by the following Sunday, he was back to teaching Henry Spanish numbers with the full-throated enthusiasm of a boy who had decided, for the time being, that the world was going to be all right. Maggie was grateful for all of it. She was also, by the end of the 2nd week, tired in a way that went down to the bone and stayed there. The baby had dropped lower. Ruth had warned her this would happen, had said it meant the body was preparing, had said 6 weeks, but had also said maybe less. And Maggie had noted both things and continued working, because stopping was not a thing she knew how to do until her body made the decision for her. It made the decision on a Thursday night. She woke at 2 in the morning with a pain that was different from the low backache she'd been managing for weeks. Sharper, more deliberate, centered and specific, and interval-based in a way that was not ambiguous to a woman having her fourth child. She lay still for a moment and counted. Confirmed the interval. Counted again. Then she got up, dressed herself carefully, went to Clara's room, and put her hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara woke immediately, the way she always woke. Fully, no transition, already processing. "Is it time?" Clara said. "Get Eli," Maggie said, quietly. "Don't wake the little ones." Clara was out of the bed before Maggie finished the sentence. She heard Clara's knock on Eli's door down the hall. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, nothing panicked, and then Eli's voice, low and immediate, and then movement. By the time Maggie had made it to the kitchen and put water on the stove, Eli was in the doorway with his boots on and his coat half fastened, and his face entirely composed in a way that cost him something. She could see it, the deliberate composure of a man holding himself steady by will. "I need to send for Ruth," she said. "Davis is already saddling." He came into the kitchen. Clara woke him first. Maggie looked down the hall. Clara was standing at the end of it, arms at her sides, watching with those old eyes in that young face. "Go back to bed," Maggie told her. "No," Clara said, simply and without heat. Under other circumstances, Maggie might have argued it. She looked at her daughter for a moment. 9 years old. 2 years of watching her mother manage catastrophe alone, and said, "Then come in here where I can see you." Clara came and sat at the kitchen table and folded her hands on top of it, which was so precisely what Maggie herself did when she was managing anxiety through stillness, that it stopped her breath for a second. The contractions were 7 minutes apart when Davis rode out. They were 5 minutes apart when the first gray light came through the kitchen window. They were 3 minutes apart when Ruth Manyhorses came through the front door, snow on her coat, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 30 years and knew that urgency and panic were different things, and only one of them was useful. She looked at Maggie. She looked at Clara. She looked at Eli, who was standing at the kitchen wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes doing something that he was working very hard to keep off the rest of his face. "Out," Ruth said to him. "I'm staying," he said. "Eli," her voice was not unkind, "you being in this room helps nothing, and costs this woman something she needs for the work ahead. Out." He looked at Maggie. She looked back at him, and she saw it clearly. The thing he'd been carrying since 1876, since a room not unlike this one, since doing everything right and having it not be enough. It was in the set of his mouth and the particular stillness of a man who had already survived something once, and wasn't certain he could survive the knowing, the waiting, the helplessness of standing outside a door. "I'll call you," Ruth said, quieter, "the moment there's something to call you for. I promise you that." He uncrossed his arms. He looked at Maggie for a moment longer. One long, direct look that said several things that neither of them had yet put into words. And he went. The door didn't close all the way. She could see the shadow of his boots in the gap at the bottom, just outside the threshold, not leaving. Ruth saw it too. She said nothing about it. "Clara," Maggie said, "I'm here." "You're going to help Ruth. Do exactly what she says. Nothing extra, nothing less." "Yes, ma'am." Clara stood, pushed her sleeves up, and went to the washstand without being directed, which made Ruth glance at her with the brief, assessing look of a woman recalibrating her expectations upward. "How old are you?" Ruth asked her. 9, Clara said. Ruth handed her a cloth. "You'll do fine," she said, with the certainty of a professional judgment. And Clara received it with a nod and got to work. What happened in the next 2 hours was the oldest and most serious work in the world. And Maggie did it the way she did everything, with her full attention, and without complaint, and without asking anyone for more than they could give. The pain was honest and complete, and she breathed through it the way Ruth told her to breathe, and held Clara's hand when Clara offered it, and did not think about anything except the immediate and necessary thing in front of her. At some point she heard Henry's voice from down the hall, confused, half asleep, calling for her, and heard Tommy's voice answering, low and reassuring, and then the sound of small feet being redirected away from the kitchen. And she was grateful for Tommy, in a way that she filed away to tell him later. The baby came just after 5 in the morning, in the gray pre-dawn of a Wyoming winter Thursday, with the snow still and the cold pressing against every window in the house, and Ruth's hands sure and certain, and Clara's voice saying something that Maggie couldn't quite hear over the specific and total focusing of all her attention on the last and hardest work of it. And then it was done. And then there was a sound, small, indignant, absolutely certain of itself. That was the best sound Maggie had heard since she couldn't remember when. "A girl," Ruth said, and put her in Maggie's arms. She was red and furious and perfect, and she weighed what felt like a small, dense universe, and she smelled like the beginning of everything. "Hello," Maggie said, barely above a whisper. "There you are. I've been waiting for you." Clara was crying. She hadn't made any sound doing it. She was her mother's daughter. But her face was entirely wet, and she didn't appear to have noticed. She looked at the baby with the expression of someone receiving the confirmation of something they had believed for a long time without evidence. "She looks like she knew what she was doing," Clara said. "She absolutely did," Maggie agreed. Ruth went to the door. She opened it without ceremony and said, "Come in now." Eli was there in 2 steps. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at Maggie in the chair with the baby, and something crossed his face that was not anything she'd seen there before. Not the recalculation, not the measured assessment, not the controlled composure. Just a man who had braced for the worst for 2 hours in a cold hallway and was now confronted with the fact of a living woman and a living child, both of them present and breathing and fine. His throat moved. "Come here," Maggie said. He came. He sat in the chair Clara had vacated, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples, and the scar along his jaw from something old and healed. He looked at the baby. "A girl," Maggie said. "Yes." The word came out rough. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him steadily. "I haven't named her yet. I've been thinking about what to name her since somewhere around Cheyenne, and I've been going back and forth. And this morning I made up my mind." She looked down at the baby, who had stopped being furious and was now engaged in the serious business of existing. "My mother's name was Helen. Daniel's mother was Frances. I thought about both of them." Eli was very still. "But the name I keep coming back to," Maggie said, "is Sarah." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. She watched him take that in, watched it move through him, the way serious things move through people who had learned to be still, from the outside in, slow and thorough and complete. His jaw worked once. His hands, resting on his knees, pressed flat and then released. "My mother's name," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know. Mrs. Parrish mentioned it once, in passing. I don't know why it stayed with me, but it did. And when she was born, it was the only name that seemed right." She watched his face. "If you'd rather I didn't—" "No." He said it quickly, firmly, closing that sentence before it finished. He looked at the baby again. At her small, certain face, at her hands, at the uncomplicated confidence of a new person who had arrived and intended to stay. "Sarah," he said softly, trying it. The baby opened her eyes. Dark, unfocused, directed at nothing and everything. Whatever the last wall was, the last piece of the thing he'd been holding closed for 5 years, through 2 winters of burnt coffee and bad books, and the hallway shelf with a box on it nobody touched. It came down quietly and without drama, the way well-built things finally give when they've held long enough. He put his hand over his eyes and sat there and breathed and didn't say anything, and didn't need to. Clara watched him from across the kitchen with a 9-year-old's complete and unsentimental understanding of what she was seeing, and said nothing, which was the right thing. Ruth was packing her bag at the far end of the room. She glanced once at Eli, then at Maggie, with the expression of a woman confirming a thing she had already known. She finished packing, set the bag by the door, and said, 2 weeks rest. Real rest, not your version of rest. Broth today. Solid food tomorrow. I'll come back Friday. She looked at Clara. You did well. Clara straightened. Thank you, ma'am. Ruth picked up her bag, put on her coat, and walked out through the front door into the early morning like a woman who had somewhere else to be, which she probably did. The kitchen was quiet after she left. Outside, the ranch was beginning to wake. Sounds of the barn, boots on the bunkhouse porch, Hector's voice in the yard saying something to Davis in the flat conversational tone of men starting a workday. The world continuing its ordinary business, indifferent and reassuring. Eli lowered his hand from his face. He was composed again, or close to it. The kind of compose that looked different from before. A little less like armor, and a little more like something chosen. He looked at Maggie. I need to tell you something, he said. All right? 3 months ago, when I saw you coming up the north road. He looked at his hands. I watched you for about a quarter mile before you got to the gate. The way you were walking, like the cold and the distance and the weight you were carrying, were all just information you were processing, not reasons to stop. He paused. I'd already decided before you set the ledger down. Maggie looked at him. Decided what? She said. That whatever you were coming to ask for, the answer was going to be yes. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. The ledger just confirmed the reasoning. She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound against her chest and settled back into sleep, completely confident that the arms holding her were not going anywhere. That's not a very practical basis for a decision, Maggie said. No, he agreed. It isn't. You've been known to make impractical decisions then. Occasionally. The corner of his mouth moved. Don't tell Hector. She looked at him. This man in her kitchen in the early morning, with red eyes and steady hands, and 5 years of held grief finally set down somewhere it could rest. And she thought about what his mother would have said, the mail-order bride from Ohio who had chosen living over starving proud. She thought about what Caroline would have said, the woman from Virginia who had looked at problems until she understood what they needed. She thought about what her own mother would have said, and about what Daniel would have said, and about what all of them might agree on across whatever distance separated the living from the people who had loved them and gone ahead. She thought they would probably all say the same thing, which was that a good thing was worth acknowledging plainly and without excessive delay. Eli, she said. He looked at her. When the spring comes, she said, and the roads are clear, and this one is old enough to travel. She looked down at Sarah, asleep and certain. I'd like to go see Calhoun in Cheyenne. About the property question. About what Franklin's letters actually establish. I'll take you, he said. I know. She met his eyes. I also want to stop at the courthouse on the way. He was still. "For a different kind of paperwork," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the sun was fully up now, coming through the kitchen window at a low winter angle that caught the dust in the air and made everything look deliberate and lit from the inside. Henry's voice sounded from down the hall, awake now, calling her name, the impatient and unworried call of a 4-year-old who assumed his mother was somewhere nearby and available. Clara's footsteps moved toward him, quiet and certain. "That's a practical suggestion," Eli said. The words carried something more than they said, and she heard all of it. "It is," she agreed. "Very practical." He nodded once. He looked at the baby, at her small, closed face, at her fingers curled against Maggie's coat. He reached out and put one finger, very gently, against Sarah's hand, and Sarah's hand, with the absolute reflex certainty of the newly arrived, closed around it. He went still, stayed that way, and Maggie watched the last of 5 years of careful, necessary distance quietly become something else. Not gone, because lost didn't go. It just learned to share the space. And she thought about broken boards and brass keys and ledgers that told the truth, and women who walked 4 miles in the snow because the alternative was stopping. And she thought that the best structures were never the ones that looked perfect from the outside. They were the ones built by people who knew which wood would hold and which would warp, who understood that a good frame needed honest materials and patient hands, and the willingness to stay with the work past the point when walking away would have been easier. Sarah slept in her arms. Eli's hand stayed where it was. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and morning. And down the hall, her children were waking up into the first day of what this was going to be. And outside the window, the Wyoming sky was going from gray to the particular blue that came after hard weather. Clear and cold and unreserved. The kind of sky that made no promises, except the one a clear sky always made, which was that the storm was finished and the ground was still there. And whatever you intended to build, you could begin. They were not the same two people who had sat across this table 4 weeks ago. A widow with $4 and a ledger. A man who couldn't keep his own books and hadn't changed the smell of his kitchen in 2 years. They were what those two people had become by staying, by working, by telling the truth in the specific ways that mattered most, by building something in the cold and the difficulty and the ordinary days between the crises, without ceremony and without unnecessary words. Some things needed saying plainly, and she had said them plainly. Some things needed building, and they had built them. And some things, the ones that lasted, the ones that held through the worst the weather could manage, were not given to you. They were made, piece by piece, from whatever honest materials came to hand, by people who had learned that the right question was never whether to start over, but whether you were willing to stay with what you'd started until it became something real. Maggie Calloway held her daughter and looked at the man across from her who was learning, for the first time in 5 years, that his hands were still good for holding on. And she knew, with the same certainty she brought to a column of figures that came out exactly right, clean, irreducible, true, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be.